A new book is revealing more details about that now infamous phone call between former President Trump and Ukraine's President Zelenskyy. Alexander Vindman listened into that call in which Mr. Trump asked Zelenskyy to investigate then Democratic candidate Joe Biden and his son Hunter. It led to the impeachment trial for former President Trump, where Vindman gave key testimony. He's now sharing his story of what happened during that 2019 call and the fallout afterwards in a new book titled Here, Right Matters, An American Story. For more, I want to bring in Alexander Vindman, the author of the book. He's also a retired U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel, as well as the former Director for European Affairs for the United States National Security Council. Alexander Vindman, welcome. Great to have you with us. I wonder, seeing how everything turned out, do you have any regrets about the process? Is there anything you would have done differently?
So in terms of my own participation or my own inclusion, being dragged into this, a private citizen, somebody that's used to being behind the scenes, I wish it didn't happen. I wish I wasn't in the position where I had to choose between my career and a potentially new path in life. But do I have regrets about how things unfolded? Not really. I know that I contributed to our national security, to America's national security, by reporting the president's corruption and the president's efforts to subvert free and fair elections. In that regard, I regret nothing. I just wish I didn't have to be dragged into the public eye and become a public figure.
So the title of your book is Here, Right Matters. But the fact that the military did not defend you, you lost your job as a result of doing your duty, regardless of such an illustrious career in the military, that can all leave readers with the impression that, in fact, right didn't matter. Is that title meant to be ironic at all?
No, not at all. Actually, I think there's a layered notion to Here, Right mattering. Here, right mattered to at that moment. Right mattered to me. My values were being challenged, and I was not going to compromise myself and cover up presidential corruption. It also mattered due to the gravity of the moment. The president was trying to subvert free and fair elections. It mattered. It mattered that I took a stand. It mattered that every day there are public servants in the system working hard, living up to their institutional obligations, to their values and ethics that they've have developed over the course of decades. And ultimately, I think it matters to America and preserving the America that we want it to be. We have to make matter happen. I'm sorry. We have to make Here, Right matter, to put that in artfully, but it's on us to make this the country we want it to be.
And if you can, explain to us just what went through your mind as you were listening in to the president's call, as he knew you and others were. Was there a precise moment when perhaps confusion turned to dismay? What was sort of the train of thoughts going through your head?
So to understand, this is an understated statement, but it's quite possible that the president didn't know that there were other people on the call. He may have very well thought it was just him and the people that were in his immediate space with him. The president never focused on process, never took the time to learn how the national security apparatus worked. And I think it's quite possible he just didn't realize that there would be other people on the line monitoring this conversation and in a position to potentially report wrongdoing. For me, it was an instantaneous response. I knew exactly what I needed to do. I saw this train wreck unfolding over the course of weeks and months. And not until that phone call did I realize the president was the driving force, but I knew right away what I had to do, which was report it like I had done on many other occasions, both in my career when I saw wrongdoing and specifically with this president and this effort to, again, subvert elections, subvert national policy with regards to Ukraine.
Right. And you've said you instantly knew what the president was saying was impeachable behavior. You also believed once you reported it to your superiors, it would be out of your hands. They would do the right thing with the information. What was your thought process when you realized that wasn't necessarily the case?
Sure, that is exactly right. I did not realize that these officials were going to abrogate their responsibilities and basically sit on the information. I thought that what they would do is they would go back to the president, and like had happened on so many occasions with regard to this president, he'd receive counsel suggesting that what he had done was dangerous to the United States, dangerous to his own political career, and the president would reverse course. Happened so many times. And that did not happen in this case. But I also didn't dwell on it. After I made my report, I went back to my job, which was basically ensuring that we had a strong relationship with Ukraine, not for Ukraine's sake, but for America's sake. Ukraine is a buffer against Russian aggression, and I wanted to make sure that we were leveraging that buffer to protect U.S. interests. And I didn't dwell on it, didn't realize that behind the scenes, all this was unfolding until September, when House inquiries started their investigation and when the whistleblower's complaint became public.
And in your book, you write a lot about your upbringing and the influence your father has had on you, bringing you and your brothers from Ukraine to the U.S. when you were very young. Very idealistic about what the U.S. represents. Yet your father didn't want you to report what you heard on the president's call. What were your father's fears exactly, and what does he now think of your actions?
Yeah. So I think that's, that statement of "Here Right Matters" just came out as a result of Representative Maloney's question. It was nothing pre-staged. It was extemporaneous. What I think that statement meant was that the U.S. was different. My dad was channeling his 47 years of experience, his understanding that in a Soviet regime and authoritarian regime, the risks would be drastic. I could lose my life. I could lose my livelihood. The whole family could be punished. So he was channeling that when he counseled me to reconcile with the president. My experience being different, being raised in the United States, being a uniformed military service member, I recognized that this country was different. I wouldn't have to suffer those slings and arrows, but I was putting my career at risk. And I took my own counsel. I listened to my dad, listened to his concerns, but I ultimately took my own counsel as to what I thought was right.
So in the end, were you both then a little disappointed in the result? Because as you say, you had a very idealistic notion of what is the right thing to do, what is your duty here, and in America, that's what matters. But in the end, it didn't quite work out that way. So was there, did the scales fall from your eyes a bit?
At various points in the past couple of years, I've had my faith shaken is too strong a word, but I've had my faith in the U.S. questioned. But in reality, it still remains strong. I wear this American flag pin to remind me of what this country is, what it stands for, the greatness and power and the hope that this country offers. And my own personal trials and tribulations, while they were significant to me, to my family, in the big scheme of things, I believe I contributed to the defense of my nation, and I could live with the consequences of my actions.
And you continue to dedicate your life to that, correct? What is next for you?
Sure. So I'm undertaking a doctorate in international affairs from Johns Hopkins University. So like this, I could be even a better advisor on foreign policy issues, national security. I am on the board of a non-governmental organization, the Renewed Democracy Initiative, where we're basically looking at ways to harden our democracy and stem the tide of rising authoritarianism in the United States. I'm doing advocacy for public service, everything that, frankly, I did in uniform with an eye towards serving this nation. I continue to try to do out of uniform, and I look for opportunities to do that. And I encourage other people to make right matter.
Alexander Vindman, thank you so much for joining us, and thank you for your service.
Thank you.